I guess in my 52-year railroad career, I have walked to the moon and back on railroad platforms just like this in the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And I've come to know there are a lot of untold stories and even a few secrets out there involving the railroad industry. Please join us and subscribe so we can continue to bring you those untold stories and even a few secrets from America's railroad past.
All aboard! Highball it, Eagle!
Have you heard the travel news about the Eagle Way? To your destination happening every day. The Texas Eagle is clicking on the rail. From the Windy City to the Alamo, meet you at the station, come on, let's go. People get ready and catch the wave. Catch the wave, the Texas Eagle Way. Through the heart of the nation of travel.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my podcast. I've seen some trains before, hopefully to capture some railroad history memories that will be forgotten to time if we don't record them now. We're honored today to have as my guest Michael David Dwyer. Before I introduce him more substantially, I would like to tell you about some upcoming podcasts that have now been confirmed. Not in any particular order. We'll have Art Anderson, who went from reservation and information booth clerk to station master at Chicago Union Station. We'll have his story. We'll have former Amtrak President David Gunn and his remarkable life and times. Inner City President Lee Bullock, his story. And Amtrak Western Business Group President Frank Forcione, who will also tell of his railroad experience, strength, and hope. But today we're honored to have a longtime friend of mine, Mike Dwyer. Mike, I can't tell you how much I appreciate your willingness to share your memories. I want to introduce you this way. Ladies and gentlemen, I had the privilege of not only working with, but working for at a very brief time, Mr. Dwyer. And Mike, have you ever been over here to Longview to see my old 1968 Cadillac convertible, my Cadillac DeVille?
I have not seen the Cadillac DeVille, but I have been to Longview and Marshall and experienced the swamp bucket at a local eatery.
Oh, yes, you have. Well, I want to tell you that owner's manual in the 1968 DeVille describes the horn on that car as quietly authoritative. And I want you to know that's how I've always thought of you. You're quietly behind the scenes, or at least in my railroad career, quietly behind the scenes, authoritatively making positive results. And for those of us who had the privilege to experience your working style, thank you. I've entitled your podcast.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. I've entitled your podcast from Burlington Northern Railway Gandy dancer, which for those who don't know is a track laborer, to dishwasher, to Amtrak West Coast Product Line Director. And I believe you were the Product Line Director of three important trains or services, the Coast Starlight, the Chief and Southwest Chief, and the Surfliners. Is my memory failing?
That's correct.
All right. Well, you know what? There's no better place to start than at the beginning. And ladies and gentlemen, one of the reasons that I've started this podcast is try to capture before it's lost the history of those remarkable individuals who were working for the railroad before Amtrak was invented. So ultimately helped the railroads make the transition to the Amtrak era. And Mr. Dwyer is certainly one of these people. Sir, as I told you on the phone a few days ago, having been a Gandy dancer myself, I will assure you I would have considered it as a promotion to go from track laborer to dishwasher in the dining car. At least you could open the vestibule door down there and get a little cool breeze, I would hope, running through there.
Well, the Gandy dancer, my stepfather worked for the CB&Q. And when they merged, he was transferred up to St. Paul. And when I got out of school, that was when we still had the draft going on. I was a 1A, and that was the wind down of the Vietnam War. So I was looking for a summer job, and they needed able, healthy, well-being individuals to put in the North Yard up in Minneapolis. So I got hired and went out there. I really didn't know what to expect. All I got was my steel-toed boots, which they did come in handy. But in those days, we had to pull out all the ties, and a lot of them would be stamped, 1890, 1900, and they were really pieces of wood. And then we would put
for our audience, let's tell them what that is. Those, ladies and gentlemen, those are date nails that the previous generation actually put into the cross tie with the year it was installed, so they could determine how long a creosoted cross tie would last.
Correct.
And consequently, in Mr. Dwyer's and my later times, we saw some date nails that had some early dates on them.
Yeah, exactly. And so I did that for probably, it was about a 30-day period. And as the railroad is good in those days, it would furlough you. If they didn't need you, they would furlough you. Right. And that didn't mean you were it was their term for laying off, but just hold on, we might have another job in a couple months for you. And then they'd call you back. That was typical for the railroad. And but so that was working for Burlington Northern. And most of the
What year would that have been, Mike?
That would have been 1973.
Okay.
And most of the guys out there, you had some, old heads that were out on the road working there. And then you had a lot of young college students, especially football players for various football teams in the Minneapolis area, including the University of Minnesota. And I used to play football and had looked at St. Thomas University there, but I decided not to pursue that. And so you'd go out there, get in shape, and put on some muscle, swinging the hammer, and dragging those ties out. And so I did that for about a month, which was enjoyable, except when you had to put a frog in or a switch tie. And we worked in about 90-degree heat. So you mentioned earlier, it must have been a different situation. I wish I could say that, because working out in the heat was one thing, because I would always look forward to my favorite cold beverage, which was a Fresca in my lunchbox, because somehow that quenched my thirst. And then after about 35 days, I ended up going to, I got laid off, and my dad called the St. Paul Commissary, which was still being run by Burlington Northern at the time. And
in Amtrak's early days, ladies and gentlemen, a lot of times the railroad companies themselves, the legacy railroad companies who had been running passenger trains on their own, after Amtrak came along, they still did contract work for Amtrak in several departments. So the BN commissary at St. Paul was one of those.
Correct. And of course, they're always in need of help. And I got hired as a second cook, because in those days you had the chef, the first cook, and the second cook. I didn't quite know what I was in for. I was told to get my salt and pepper slacks. They would give me my, my white jacket.
Tell us what hat. Salt and pepper. What are salt and pepper slacks?
Salt and pepper, the traditional pants that people in the kitchen wear. Right. And, they were cotton, baggy, and, they were good for kitchen. So if they got dirty, they were easy to clean, because you didn't want to wear white. It's kind of like, a construction worker, they wear jeans or something easy to clean.
Yes. And now, were you at this juncture still a Burlington Northern Railway employee?
I started out as Burlington Northern. Later on, it switched to Amtrak.
Okay. But
And
you've been hired as a second cook
correct,
for the Burlington Northern Railway. All right. Go ahead, sir.
correct. And in those days, the clerk for I guess on the Amtrak side was actually Rick Johnson, who used to be the district manager. He sadly has passed away
I remember
for the
Mr.
Minneapolis
Johnson.
area, and he worked for J.J. Jenkins at that time up there. And in those days, Rick, for those of us that knew him, and he was a great member to have on the Go team. He in those days had an afro, which was very typical in the early 70s, even for us white guys to have an afro.
I had one myself. I understand.
Well, I can't picture that, but
I'll have to put one in one of the podcasts.
Anyway, so I got hired as a second cook, not knowing what to expect, and the train was a step on, step off agreement. So the crew, you would load your stock on, but the crew that was inbound had actually made a trip from St. Paul to Minneapolis, back to Chicago, and then to St. Paul, and then you got off. That following year, it changed to the Minneapolis station. But and then you would load your supplies, and then you'd go to bed at night because they were done serving, and then you'd find your place in the dorm room, go to bed, and then be back on duty about 5 o'clock the next morning. Now, for me,
for our listeners, for our viewers, a dormitory car is where the crew sleeps overnight on a long distance passenger train.
Correct. And there were a variety. Yeah, there were a variety of dorm cars. Mine happened to be, I don't know if it would be the Plaza Suites. If anybody who ever slept in a dorm car would say it was the Plaza, because I don't think so. But they were 3 high bunks. And if you were young like me and green like me, and the old railroaders would call us young bloods, you ended up sleeping on the top bunk. And one thing they didn't tell you is make sure you use the straps to keep you in the bunk.
Yes.
Because I didn't realize how much sway a train has going down the tracks, at 70 miles an hour or 79 miles an hour, 80 miles an hour. And sometimes you'd hear a thud in the middle of the night, and that was somebody who had fallen out of their rack. But it was a dorm for anybody, and we had standing stalls for showers and restrooms. And if you were lucky enough to be the dining car steward, which we still had in those days, or the bar car, they called it employee in charge in those days, then you would get your own separate accommodation because you carried money, you handled money.
Yes. And so for a brief recap, you've come out of maintenance of way service as a track laborer, and you're now a second cook. But you're a second cook. You're still drawing a paycheck from the Burlington Northern Railway as a second.
Correct.
And your crew base has moved from St. Paul to Minneapolis. So you're running Minneapolis to Seattle to Chicago and back to Minneapolis.
Correct. And in those days, you could.
How many days out was that total?
That was a 6-day trip.
Wow. How much time off? How much time off?
I was an extra board employee, and I'll just say I was out there to make money for the summer, and the most I ever worked was 30 days straight.
Right. Ladies and gentlemen, for those who may not know, an extra board employee means that Mr. Dwyer wasn't guaranteed any time off. He could have gone out the very next day after coming in from a 6-day trip. And it sounds like, well, for 30 days in a row, you did do it.
Yeah, and I remember that in particular because I was on the North Coast Hiawatha, and I was called to be because you could either work the North Coast Hiawatha, which was still running in those days, or the Empire Builder.
Now, these are both long distance Chicago to Seattle trains.
Correct.
Okay.
And the Hiawatha, for those that don't know about it, it used to stop in Livingston, Montana, which would be the gateway to Yellowstone. And then Correct. It would go to Butte and on into Seattle. And so anyway, we were working on both the Hiawatha or the Builder, and then we would have a layover in Seattle, come back, go all the way to Chicago, then come back to Seattle or to Minneapolis, and then you get off, and then they'd call you, or they might even meet you and say, hey, we need a job to be filled the next day. And because you were on the board, you'd go depending upon what it is. And for those that don't know about the dining car, which I would either work dining cars or coach or sleeping cars in those days, the average day was 16 hours a day, sometimes longer, up to 18 hours. And so you'd be there in the morning at 5 o'clock in the morning, and you'd work until the dining car was closed, and which meant when the last customer or the last guest ate, then you'd go to bed or clean up. But in those days, when I remember my first trip, we used to have the old cafeteria style thick china, and it still had the old Northern Pacific logos on it. Yes. And then the little green things. We still had silver service with the water yes. pitchers and the tea and the coffee. So, yes. But we didn't have to, as the second cook, and I should tell you what that entailed, is the second cook, we had two forms of heat in the dining car. Presto logs were used to heat the stove. Okay. We also had gas. Okay. But sometimes the gas was leaking. That was not unusual on those old diners. And then we used dry ice to cool the refrigerators to keep things cold. So it was not unusual to get steam burns in the dining car because the steam would be coming through the train. And so the coffee maker was all steam, all the steam table was steam. And the second cook, not only did they have to wash dishes, they had to garnish all the entree plates at the end of the trip as the food came from the chef or the first cook. And the first cook did most of the cooking. The chef would stand and work. We actually had a barbecue salamander there where they cooked steaks and that. So you had to remember all the orders in your head. There were no tickets.
What is a barbecue salamander?
Well, we had briquettes. So that was like if you go into a dinner house and they want to broil, you could broil it there.
I got you. Like the Presto logs that.
Well, but the small, like you use on your charcoal, yes. Like a Weber grill.
Yes, but a flammable product you had to set on fire, just like the Presto logs.
If the gas wasn't working, yes.
If the gas wasn't working. What I wanted to tell our viewers was, for those who don't know, in those days, that's before hotel power had come to the locomotives, meaning electric generators on the locomotives that supplied to this day electricity for the entire train. And when he's talking about the steam heat, ladies and gentlemen, all of those diesel passenger locomotives had steam generators on them. and there were steam lines that ran from that locomotive all throughout the train, which powered things like that coffee maker you're talking about. And believe it or not, powered air conditioning systems. The easy to do heat, but how it was kind of convoluted how they powered the air conditioners, but they did when those worked too. So,
Well, go ahead.
So you're under the supervision of the first cook?
Well, you're under the chef is who you report to.
Okay.
And the dining car steward in those days would be in charge of the dining car. So the steward, and you would have typically in those days 4 waiters because it was a 48-seater. You have two doubles on the bottom, and then you had your other tables on the top, and you have your pantry. And in those days, the wait staff would have to do all the salads, all the appetizers, all the desserts, and have to wash all the silverware in their little scullery area. And then
now
the
wait,
kitchen.
when you said top and bottom, is this double-decker equipment we're speaking of?
No,
here?
this was all single level.
Okay, what do you mean? What do you mean by top and bottom?
Well, the top and bottom of the dining car. So if you happen to be the pantry person or waiter number 1, you always worked the top of you never left. You always had 2 tables at the top, closest to the steward in the steward station, because you had other duties to do, keep the pantry stocked. That's why they call it a pantry man. Then you had the second and third, and the second might be the silver man. The third might be the linen person to have all the linen, because we had linen. We had tabletops, linen toppers, linen napkins. And then the fourth was called the mule by the other waiters. That was a typical term. So the mule did everything that the others didn't want to do or picked up the pieces.
But was that normally the man with the lowest seniority?
Correct.
Okay. All right.
And it was very, in those days, it was very common that each meal would be at least 200, possibly up to 300 meals that you would be serving each meal.
Wow.
And
each meal.
Each meal.
Wow.
And everything was cooked from the nub. The French toast, the railroad French toast that was so famous. We used to cook in full hotel pans with hot grease in it on a moving train. We'd take the Texas loaf, we'd cut it, trim it, do an egg batter, and then cook it in the hotel pan. We'd make fried chicken on the train with real fresh fried chicken. It would be butchered. We'd cut it up in the back and cook it. Prime rib we would have in the back. Eggs to order. You'd have your small pans and do your eggs. Pancakes, same thing. So all of that was made in those days, carrying on the tradition from the railroads of cooking on board.
So it is very safe to say you learned your dining car culinary expertise from former Northern Pacific and former Great Northern and former CB&Q employees.
Yes.
Okay. And
I was going to add one thing.
Yes, sir.
My first trip, I was so, it took me a while to get used to the hours and the sleeping. Because, it's not for, I'll just say it's not for everybody. Okay. And in those days, I think we were making maybe $4 an hour, maybe $4.50 an hour, which was pretty good money back in 1973.
Yes, it was. Yes, it was.
But the thing is that it was trying to get used to it. And I can still remember having nightmares about cleaning pans or cleaning dishes. And I remember one time I got up in the middle of the night, saying apple pie, because I'd served so many apple pies, which we baked in the kitchen. So
That's wonderful. Yeah, thank you for reminding me of that pay scale. I went to work for the Texas and Pacific Railway in 1971 in train service, and I made $23.15 a day, and that included air pay, meaning I got paid extra to get between the cars and couple and uncouple the air hoses. The point is, $23.15 a day, $1971. I thought I had found the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. So
Well,
I understand.
absolutely. And when you're working 16 to 18 hours a day times six,
Yeah,
that adds up pretty quick.
indeed it does. Okay, so how long did the second cook position last?
Well, I worked second cook, and then that was the whole summer of 1973. And then in 1974, when I came back, I'd either work the second or the first cook, or fill in as a train attendant in the coaches or a sleeping car. And the old sleeping cars, we would have the old 10-6 sleeping cars. And for those that don't know it, the 6 were the bedrooms and the 10 were the roomettes. And in those days, all that equipment, the restroom facilities would drop directly on the tracks. So I guess that's where the saying came, it grows greener on that side of the tracks. I don't know.
Yes, that very well could be. That brings up a footnote here. As did I in my early Amtrak career. You also saw the Arab oil embargo of 73, 74, and the attendant surge in ridership we all saw on these trains. I remember one anecdote for myself. I have actually put folding chairs in a baggage car in Texarkana Union Station and seated people who needed to get to St. Louis and Chicago. And that didn't happen but one time, because guess what? We never saw those folding chairs ever again.
Well,
they didn't come back south.
We actually had the job was great, but you needed stamina on that job. Because
yes,
you worked hard, whether it was in the kitchen or the dining room or in the sleeping cars. But we also had in those days, we ran a roomette car. And I'm trying to remember it was the up-down roomette. You have a single roomette.
It was called a duplex roomette car.
Correct. And that was probably 44 beds or 45 beds. And
yes,
you had to manage that and do the turnover. And in those days, we didn't have computers or any of that. So a lot of it depended upon the sales. Well, I ran into a trip where they triple sold the damn car.
Oh, and yes, sir. That occurred a lot in the early Amtrak era. Yes, sir.
I ended up sleeping on linen bags in the linen room, which was nothing, kind of upside down. And that was a beast of a car to work, because your turnover, you'd get to a place and you might have 10 rooms. Similar to the 30 car today, or you get to a major stop and you had to get the guest off the train, then make the bed, then put the new guest in there, and then put away your linen, and still be prim and proper, because that's the way all the old the sleeping car porters, they'd look at you and say, hey, you're looking sloppy, you better clean up your act there.
Surely. Well, those people that you're talking about, that you and I both had the privilege to know in that era, those people had been trained by the Pullman Company and to its rules and standards, and it was a high bar to follow. Yes, sir.
Oh, absolutely. And the food, coming out of the kitchen, the service there, it was good. We had a ton of mechanical issues. It would be too hot in the wintertime. You'd come out of Havre and you'd start up the mountains, and I'd say to
Havre, Montana.
Correct. And I'd say to the first cook, why do you have this liquid concoction. I'll just leave it at that. Liquid concoction there. And they would say, well, wait till we start going up the hill. And then pretty soon the fans would cut out and the temperatures in those would get up to 110, 120, and we were still cooking. And it was not unusual to lose 10 pounds in a trip.
And going up the hill, I'm interpreting that. Correct me if I'm wrong. Fill us in here. Going up the hill means that the train speed slowed to the point where it couldn't keep the batteries charged to keep your air conditioning running and your fans running.
Correct. And we started going up the well, I wouldn't say it's not the American Rockies, but it's the Montana, group of Rockies that goes up into the Canadian Rockies. Because after Shelby, you just start going up.
Right. Okay, from cook status, what happened and how did it happen? What was next?
I did that for a couple of years, which paid for my college. And in those days, for those that are still paying student loans, a quarter at the University of Minnesota cost $175 a quarter. I don't think it costs that today, and which I paid for out of my pocket in those days. And it, allowed me to get a car and, live on my own. So I did that in 73 and 74. And then I kind of took a break and I went to work for public television for a year in production in the Minneapolis area. And then I moved out to California in 1975, where I waited tables in Hollywood and, parked cars. And because my aspiration was getting into the television and film business. So I was at Warner Brothers and NBC and the first cable television station here in LA, Z Channel, doing public affairs programming, but I could never get steady work. So I always worked as a waiter. So in 1979, after I'd graduated college and I still hadn't got a steady work in that industry, and I was waiting tables at a local chain out here called Hamburger Hamlet, which was pretty well known. And I'd been doing that for about 4 or 5 years. And I saw an ad in the paper saying Amtrak hiring waiters in Los Angeles.
In the paper. Okay.
There you go. An ad in the paper. And I said, well, I can do this for 6 months and come back and look around. Okay. And so I came in with my buddy.
Wait now, for the historical record. Okay, so you had a break in your railroad service from 1975 to 1979. Is that approximately correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
But I will add this little caveat. Because I'd worked in 73 and 74, my tenured time I was grandfathered in pre-75. So for those of that retired, that made me a double dipper.
Right.
So that's why I'm smiling.
Congratulations to you, sir. Okay, so you answered the ad. Where'd you go? LA Union
Station, which had more pigeons in it than people at that time.
Right.
And so went in for the interview and was hired, and then went to the training. And the training was still on low-level equipment, a lot of it being Santa Fe equipment that we had.
Correct.
Because the Amtrak yards here was the Santa Fe yards. And I still remember the trainer there was Sandra Thompson. And then she had a couple of trainers, one with the nickname of Wimpy. And they were old-time railroaders, probably with 45 years of experience. And everything was still on China. We still served drinks in glasses, even in the bar car in those days. And so I went through that training, which was approximately 3 weeks, and then you had a training trip, a couple of training trips, and then you went to the extra board, and that all was out of LA Union Station in the back before all the remodeling was done. And then the yards, you would report at the commissary in the LA yards.
Okay, so if you went to the onboard service extra board at LAUPT, Los Angeles Union Passenger Terminal, then you could have gone on the Sunset, the Chief, the Starlight, the San Diegans. You could have gone any direction at any time. Would that be correct, or were there just
that's correct. So it was any one of those 4 trains, and later on, the Desert Wind.
Yes. Okay.
You threw that in there, and later on, you threw in the Sacramento, the overnight train to Sacramento.
The Spirit of California.
The Spirit of California, which we used to have sleeping car service and dining car service on that train.
I rode it a couple of times. It was a wonderful train. I'm sorry that and well patronized too. Okay, so you're so are you now you're under the Amtrak banner. How did that work? Could you be called as a second waiter, as a sleeping car attendant, as a lounge car attendant? How did that work?
In those days, you were hired based upon your category. So I was a waiter, service attendant, and you could be hired as the TAs were a separate category with separate seniority. The
waiters were train
attendants. Correct. Mm-hmm. Sleeping car was a separate category. Okay. Just like the old railroads, the service attendant was a separate category. The employee in charge, or now is known as the LSA, was a separate category, the barman. And then the dining car steward, which we still had around then, was another category. And then you had your chef and your first cook, or the both first and second, and eventually third cooks they had their separate from the chefs seniority. So those were the categories. But I would be on the SA board, or the waiter board, and it was still done with blocks, and you'd have your name on it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, sir. I certainly remember seeing those. All right. So your first trip out under the Amtrak banner, you were already an experienced roadman. You knew what to expect. You weren't cutting new territory. What was the first job you caught off the extra board as an Amtrak employee?
It actually happened to be on the Sunset Limited, believe it or not, and which would be leaving Los Angeles all the way to New Orleans and then back. And that was a 6-day trip. We would leave late in the evening, then get into New Orleans and then come back. And in those days, all the road crews, or the transportation crews, were still operated by the railroad.
Right.
And so they would change at their change points across the route. And in those days, we would still have the low-level cars, both dining cars, coach cars, and sleeping cars, and bar cars were all low level in those days. And yes, the thing I remember about that particular trip, is that, and you have to remember, the people that I was working with were a lot of the old service personnel from the legacy railroads, the Santa Fe, the Sunset Limited, and they had been working for 38 years, 39 years. And here I'm getting on the train. Now I'm 24 years old, 25 years old. And it was not unusual, and people may find this funny or unusual, but it was not unusual to get on, and I would be the only non-African American on that crew.
Oh, certainly, yes. Yes, and in fact, on the Sunset, so much of the early Amtrak era Sunset was still operated by Southern Pacific crew. Those men all had a Southern Pacific heritage and had worked the Sunset Limited under the Southern Pacific banner.
Correct. And it was a great experience. And you work with, and the funny thing for me is you never knew anybody's name until you maybe a few trips in, but everybody had a nickname in those days. And you go into the dining car and you weren't working with Sam, Joe, and Harry. You were working with the Godfather, Kojak, Smiley, or Easy Money, or Wounded Knee, or Chicken Liver, or Cheeseburger.
Yes, we had one on our route over here, the route of the Texas Eagle, and simply because the poor chap wore sunglasses, he immediately picked up the name Unabomber. So he was the Unabomber from that point forward. Okay, so what's the next step? Did you stay in that service long enough to establish a regular job, or did you take a promotion?
Well, I stayed as a service attendant probably until the next year, and then I became an EIC in those days.
Employee in charge, which means
correct.
you handled the money,
the bar car, and occasionally be in the dining car. And I remember a little story that I'll tell is I went to my training, and the gentleman that was doing the training was Mr. Sims. And Mr. Sims always would have his glasses kind of sideways like this, and he was a chain smoker. And Herman was a really nice guy, but he was nervous. Well, it was not until I got to know him I understood why, because he had understood the siege of Khe Sanh as a cook.
Oh, wow.
And what I came to realize later is that a lot of the guys that had come to Amtrak in the 70s were ex-Vietnam vets.
That's correct. Yes, sir.
And so it was interesting to learn their stories, and it might have explained some of their interesting habits.
That is a great aside to that, and something I hadn't considered. I bet he was a heck of a cook too.
He was, but he had chosen to be an LSA because he didn't want to be in the kitchen. And so, to finish the story, he saw me. He said, "What are you here for?" And I said, "Well, I'm here to be a EIC." He says, "You know what you're doing. You pass. Go."
Well, what a compliment to you. All right. Was the next step for you then the legacy job, which certainly doesn't exist anymore today and probably never will, unfortunately? Was your next step dining car steward?
I worked the steward position. I never took the seniority in the steward position because what happened was in 80, with the change of presidents in 1982, from President Carter to President Reagan, we underwent some, and this is pre-Superliner, some real, let's just say, stringent budget cutting on the trains.
Oh, yes, we did.
And because I don't believe that Mr. Reagan was a fan of the trains.
He was not, and especially his Office of Management and Budget Director, David Stockman. Mr. Stockman was not a fan of the trains.
Correct. And so we had worked in LA. We also had the privilege of working the old Santa Fe Chief El Capitan cars. So we would have the old dining cars, which the Superliner was modeled after.
Correct.
Okay. And then we also had the old El Capitan car, which had the Cucina room downstairs, so named because it had the Cucino sand paintings in the car. And that became later on, it was refurbished and became the parlor car that went on the Coast Starlight in the early 90s that became so widely. Correct.
The specific. Tell us, let's digress for 1 second. Tell us about the Kachina coffee shop and how that was staffed and how you got service there. Did you, it was a double-decker car, right? Was the dining car upstairs and the coffee shop?
The dining car was upstairs. Now Santa Fe had they had a double diner too, but it was low level. That was on kind of the Super Chief train. And then they had the El Capitan car, which was the double decker Santa Fe. And what would happen was in the bar car, which was the bar car, you'd have the upstairs bar, which was kind of like a window bar with a sliding door and with tabletops upstairs. And then you had the Kachina room downstairs, which had hot dogs on this rotating spit and 4 tables downstairs. Later on, of course, it was made into a theater with the parlor car. And you had to walk downstairs to that particular car.
Was there an attendant downstairs?
Yes, there was an attendant upstairs and downstairs.
Okay.
And the first time I worked the Kachina room, if you'll let me just go off into a little story, we were on train number 4 going to Chicago.
So you were eastbound from LA. Okay.
Correct. And so we were going eastbound, and as we're going, we had just left, we just come through Lamy, and we were coming up the pass, and we were getting close to, let me see, Wagon Mound. We hadn't got quite to Wagon Mound yet. And we got stuck in a place called Shoemaker Canyon. And Shoemaker Canyon is a little canyon with sycamore trees and a stream running through it. And I would always point out to customers, I said, look for the deer and the wild turkeys out here. Well, we got a conductor came through at that time. And again, it was still Santa Fe conductors at that time.
Early.
They came through and told us there's a derailment ahead. We're going to have to turn the train.
Now, okay. tell our audience what that means. A freight train derailment ahead. Correct. And what does turn the train mean?
Turn the train means is they're going to have to back up the train to a Y to get the engines to the front of the train. And then the crew would generally turn with that train, or some of the crew would go through with the train to the final destination of Chicago. And I've had it where, as an LSA, your 6-day trip could quickly turn into 10 days on the road, or 11 days because you had to stay with the money. And anyway, we had to turn the train. So we had to get the customers off the train. Well, the only available transportation was school buses. So right. School buses would pull up to the little road. The customers would get on the school bus and then go around the derailment to the other train, and they'd get on that train, and then the train would go back to Chicago, and we'd turn around and go back to LA.
As number 3 westbound was turned around to go back to Chicago as your number 4.
Correct.
Got it.
And it was just an amazing experience. And one of the reasons why I remember it so well is that we had a colorful train attendant who happened to be working in those days. And he came up to me, and I was in the Kachina room, standing. I had the vegetable doors open. If somebody wanted a drink or something, water, so you'd get it. And the train is motion free. And he comes up to me and he says, this is, we got to turn and we got to go back to LA. I had plans in Chicago, blah, blah, blah. Well, out of the corner of my eye, I see this dog, and, he's a mangy dog, and he way off in the distance. And I'm looking at this dog and I'm saying, that dog is coming for our train. And he keeps coming and coming. Well, you don't know whether the dog is, frothing at the mouth. Well, he comes up to this attendant who shall remain nameless. He looks him in the eye and then takes a bite out of his ankle. And then he runs off.
Oh, gosh.
And he looks at me and he says, make sure you tell him it was a wolf. It wasn't a dog. So that was my experience in a shoemaker, Kenya. But we had a lot of those.
Well, now wait, you can't just leave us there. Wasn't that attendant worried that he could be rabid? I mean, wasn't he worried for the next week?
We wrapped him up, and I think I don't know if Gene Price was in Chicago then or not. And he was the district manager. He might have gotten off in Albuquerque, because where we were, there were no hospitals.
Right.
So we applied first aid, and he may have gotten off in Albuquerque to get checked out, because that would qualify for an on the job injury.
But he didn't die of rabies.
No, he did not.
Thank goodness. Thank goodness.
But we had many instances like that. I happened to be on the train when we had the engineer strike.
Yes.
Way back. And Jay Fountain was the dining car steward, and I was running the bar. And we ended up in all places, Del Rio, Texas.
Wow.
And the late Ike Lewis was our onboard supervisor. Redcoats is what we called them in those days.
Right. And, I remember.
We had to turn that particular train in. We had to leave the train basically there in Del Rio and caught a bus into San Antonio. And we ended up all at a lady, I don't know if she's still alive, a train attendant by the name of Sylvia Cohen. We went over to her house and had ice cream on our layover, waiting for our plane, which arrived 2 days later. So
you were flown back to LA.
That's correct.
Okay. All right, sir. So go ahead. I don't want to stop you if you're on the road here.
Well, the thing is, so I worked as a waiter for a year. Then I became an LSA. My date was like 1980. And,
LSA meaning lead service attendant.
Right. In those days, they called it EIC.
Right.
And so we would, you'd run either the bar car or it could be the Cucina room. It could be, they might use you on the dining car, the steward, as a steward, a fill-in steward, or you could be on the Desert Wind. So you had all those different avenues. And I like changing the pace. I like working different routes. And so I did that for a while until 1983, when the Superliner had just come into service. And the Superliner in those days, when the Superliner came out, we actually had 6 waiters in the dining car, 2 stewards, 4 cooks downstairs, and 2 lounge car attendants up and downstairs. And at one time, we actually had 3 lounge cars on the Starlight, because it was not unusual for us to serve 250, 300 meals a night on those cars.
May I make a very brief editorial comment that
Absolutely.
Isn't it sad that people like you and I, sir, still refer to the Superliner equipment as the new cars, even though they're now 40 years old, because
Exactly.
Amtrak hasn't ordered any new long distance passenger cars for the west of the Mississippi service, west of the Mississippi River service. So it wasn't unusual for you to say, 300 meals in the diner, right? Just that.
Absolutely. And you would just, you would serve until they stopped coming through the door. That was the way it was. And in those days, we had a lot of the old dining car stewards from years ago, Mr. Gosher, Roy Sutton Jr., Roy Sutton Sr., who was out of Oakland. We had Joe Broussard. Mr. Broussard was a very colorful character. He always wore a velvet blue coat at dining car service. He'd wear it in and he'd bring folks in, or Ollie Johnson, Mr. Robertson, Mr. Zarlingo from the those people were all from the Santa Fe. And
give us the job description of a dining car steward. What was his purpose?
Their purpose was basically to run the dining car and keep with the hours of service. So if the hours of service were 6 a.m. till midnight, then you would do that. Make sure that the car was set up correctly with all the linen and silverware and salt and pepper shakers. And if you didn't, it was not uncommon. You came up to work and you didn't have your right uniform, they'd send you to your room and cut your time.
Wow.
They ran the dining car.
It's safe to say, while the conductor is the boss of the train, and everyone knows that, engineer second in command, the dining car steward is the boss of the diner. Is that safe to say?
Well, the diner, and he would also be the de facto supervisor for the rest of the crew. Not directly for the train attendants and sleeping car, but if you had a problem on the train, you'd go to the dining car steward.
Oh, wow. So if the conductor had a problem with the sleeping car attendant, he would go to the dining car steward.
Well, generally, the conductors would always go to the sleeping car attendant, but if they had an issue, they might bring in the steward. Yes.
Okay. All right, sir. So on the Superliner equipment, you're working in what capacity? Dining car steward,
some, and then also the lead service attendant. It had transitioned from EIC to lead service attendant. And then we ended up on the Superliners. And then in June of 1983, they started the chief program, the onboard service program.
The train chief program, yes.
Correct. And I was lucky enough to be selected for that initial program, and was one of the original chiefs back in 83. And I was on my train ended up being the Sunset Limited. And where I work with, I think Jay Fountain was working then, David Jones, who's passed away.
Yes.
Richard Walzak has passed away. An old dining car steward who came over from Union Pacific. And the name is at the top of my head, a black gentleman. And he's just passed away recently. And then Brad Bowers and Jimmy Pearson, I believe, were the original chiefs on that route. But the thing that made the Sunset so interesting was we also had train riders from the Southern Pacific that would ride that. They'd either ride from LA to El Paso or El Paso to San Antonio. They were electricians and mechanical people, the train riders, correct? Correct. And believe me, take it from me, in the early days of the Superliner, nothing could be greater to have one of those guys show up, because we had a lot of mechanical issues with those trains.
Absolutely. We were fortunate enough to have them over here on the route of the Texas Eagle, and they ran round trip Fort Worth, Texarkana, Fort Worth, and they were lifesavers.
Oh, they were, miracle workers at times. And, if you'd gone across, and what people don't realize is, we'd be out there in the diner or the train, and it'd be 110 degrees outside. You lose your air conditioning. It's not fun being on the train, or if the toilets happen to go out.
Oh, it's not.
When you're the supervisor, you got to walk through the train and talk to the people and face them. And they may not have the kindest words for you.
Give us a job description of a train chief.
Well, a train chief is, I think it was written to be the overall, the supervisor of the onboard crew. So they're responsible for making sure that people are in uniform, performing their duties, and in accordance with all their various times. So, if they're reporting for work at 5:30, you make sure they're reported at work. You also sign all the timesheets. So if they have extra time, if they have to be up or down, or if you had to turn a train, you would sign all the timesheets for that. And then you'd turn it in, and then you'd have a trip report if there were any incidents that might happen on that trip. You'd turn that in and file a trip report with the manager of onboard service at your local station. And then you would work directly with the conductor, for the trains, because in the past you could have 7 different conductors from LA to New Orleans. Well, if they didn't talk to each other, you might have some disconnections. But the nice thing about the old legacy conductors is most of them had been passenger train conductors. That was an elevated position within the old freight railroads. You just didn't get that job.
Absolutely.
And so, one of my favorites was Mr. Rags Guidry out of Lafayette, Louisiana.
I knew Mr. Guidry.
And you know how they talk like that down there in Louisiana.
Dude, there was a famous ball player, Guidry, and was it Ron? Anyway,
it was Ron Guidry. He was a left-handed pitcher with the New York Yankees.
And wasn't that his dad?
That is correct. And his brother was he had a brother who had a handicap, a disability, and his name was Travis. And Travis would ride with his dad a lot on the train. And we all knew him. Everybody that worked the Sunset knew Travis and loved Travis. And a side note is that Travis had some pet ducks at home. He never brought his ducks on the train, but he had his pet ducks at home, and he had names for those ducks. One was Jay Fountain, one was Michael Dwyer, and one was Brad Bowers.
All right.
So,
that's a great story.
But
tell us about. Go ahead, sir. Go ahead.
No, go.
Tell us about somebody famous or infamous you met as a train chief, because if you were on the Sunset between LA and New Orleans, you had to have encountered some famous people.
I don't know if so many you'd run into famous. I had more famous people probably on the Starlight, and Southwest Chief than on the Sunset. But I had some memorable people on the Sunset, and I'll give you a few examples. One was we had a gentleman who was he worked for an individual that you might have heard of, Mr. Sam Walton.
Absolutely.
And this gentleman happened to be his handyman. And he had known Mr. Walton, I guess, all his life, and he was riding the train out to Los Angeles. And he was a black gentleman, and just had all these stories to tell, not about Mr. Walton, but just in life in general. And all the train crew was very fascinated with him. And those are the type of things that I think that when you're on a train, everybody has a story to tell. It doesn't mean that they have to be rich or famous, but even, individuals, you're sitting there because this is in the day I'm doing this with my phone. Okay.
Correct.
That's my entertainment, right?
Correct.
Well, you had to talk to somebody, your neighbor. And so you get to meet people from all walks of life, various people. And I remember a gentleman once, I was in the bar car, and a gentleman comes up to us, and he had boarded in Lafayette, and he was telling this story about uh, New Iberia, and he was talking about the Tabasco family.
Correct. The McElhaney's.
The McElhaney's, absolutely. And I'll say it in his accent. And he says, well, he says, sometimes my nostrils, they fill up. And whenever that happens, my family is good friends with the McElhaney family. And so my mama would call Mr. McElhaney and say, hey, Mr. McElhaney, my son, his nostrils can he come over to the warehouse and smell the peppers? So I'd go over there and walk in the warehouse and smell the peppers, and everything would clear up.
Wonderful.
And, those are just those little stories. And one other that I'll pay homage to because it sticks in my head is, and although some of the interviewees that you may have, I'm in coming up, Mr. Forcione might smile at this, but it was a tradition years ago to have a crew meal on the train. Okay. And that was always a tradition on the Sunset.
Tell us what that is.
Well, a crew meal would be separate from the regular dining car menu. And that was kind of frowned upon, okay, by the upper echelon. They wanted people to eat the regular food. Well, we might make some, because when you've eaten the same food over and over again, you're looking for something different. Well, going to New Orleans, we happen to go through some of the best food eating area in the country down south in New Orleans. And so one particular trip on a Superliner, we were getting ready for dinner, and we had catfish on the dining car menu, and we served it fresh, and we would sell a ton of that. And I was lucky enough to have two gentlemen downstairs, Mr. McCall and Senior, and Mr. Joe Elder, who commuted from Atlanta to Los Angeles to work his job. Wow. So these two never stopped talking from the time you left Los Angeles to the time you got to New Orleans to the time you got back to Los Angeles. They were just chatterboxes. And Mr. McCall talked about everything, politics, this, because he was very well read. Anyway, we stopped at, I think it was Bayou Bluff, which was one of those little drawbridges. And I noticed outside the train, there was some people out there, young boys, they were fishing, and they had 2 5-gallon buckets. And, I'm walking through the train as a supervisor chief. I always walk the train because, I like to talk to people. And I felt that, it's like one person said to me one time, he says, well, how come you're not watching us? I said, what do you mean watching you? And he said, well, you're not like the other guys. You're always, they watch us all the time. I said, I don't need to watch you. I said, I got 400 sets of eyes on the train that are watching you. If there's something wrong, they're going to tell me. All I got to do is walk up and down.
Right.
And so anyway, to finish the story, I noticed that these 2 young boys came to the dining car door, and we were stopped there waiting for this bridge to come down. So I went downstairs to say, I said, hey guys, are we getting ready? Are we almost ready for dinner? And it was dead silence down there. I mean, dead silence to 2 men who never closed their mouths in their lives. It was dead silence. And I said, no, something's going on. And all of a sudden I hear splashing. And I turn around and I see a fish jumping in the scullery area. I looked back at them. They said, fresh catfish for dinner tonight. And I just shook my head. But now, those guys were great.
Was that fresh catfish for the crew meal, or did some?
That was for the crew. That was for the crew meal.
That's what I figured. Okay, so you ended your career as the product line director, which, I just love a brief aside, and I've already said this in another podcast, so I'll make it brief. I'll make it as short as possible. One of the things about Amtrak's early years and later years too, as a matter of fact, in my humble opinion, Amtrak had a tendency to try to fix things that weren't broken, because not everything about the American passenger train was broken. And one thing that we tried to fix that I saw cause great concern and consternation, we changed up all of the traditional railroad titles,
Yes.
I just, having come from the railroad industry prior to Amtrak, as you did, I just remember some of my old legacy railroad bosses asking, well, what is that? What does he do? Well, then you try to have to figure out what railroad title Amtrak had changed that into. So that's a way introduce. Go ahead.
I think the only two that they did not change was they would have like superintendents. So you would have like a superintendent of, say, dining car services in those days, or you might have a superintendent of passenger services, or you might have general superintendent, or road foreman. I think those would still stay, or train master. When I started, there were still some train masters out there, or general foreman, or mechanical superintendent. The term superintendent kind of carried over. And then that got lost, I think, in one of the reorganizations too.
And indeed it did. I use this lengthy explanation to introduce the fact that when Mr. Dwyer refers to himself as a product line director, if a legacy railroad person asked me, well, what does that mean? What is a product line director? I would say a general manager of a route. And why we couldn't use those terms, don't get me started. But anyway, we didn't change conductor or engineer, thank God, but give them time.
Yes.
So Go ahead.
I was on the Sunset, and then of course I would work, from time to time on the Starlight, or the Southwest Chief. And again, each leg of my journey, my railroad journey, would be different. I mean, and I could tell you stories from the Sunset, the Southwest Chief, the old Super Chief route, or the Starlight, or the Desert Wind, or the Surfliners, that were all different. They would, be different, like the old El Capitan cars, which a lot of people don't realize. We ran those cars before we had Superliners. We had high-level cars, and they were all high-level coaches. One of the most comfortable coach seats I've ever been in. And that carried over into the old dorm car, which was kept on for quite a long time. And a lot of people worked the Sunset because they liked the old sleeping car attendant's room, which was located in the lower level of the coach car.
Well, you brought up an interesting point there. All right, so you're now product line director of the Coast Starlight, LA to Seattle, the Southwest Chief from LA. Did you go to how far east did you go on the Chief? All the way to Chicago?
All the way to Chicago.
Wow. And then the San Diegans, or the Surfliners, I'm sorry.
It started out years ago, it was the San Diegans, then it became the Surfliners.
Okay.
And
tell us what was the most difficult, what was the fly in the ointment on the Coast Starlight? What was the biggest obstacle on that route?
I think on-time performance.
Okay.
And that speed of that train really had never changed. I remember when I was starting out, it was not unusual for that train to get into Seattle at 6 o'clock in the evening. on the second day.
When it was due at 10 o'clock in the morning, I think, wasn't it? Or some...
Well, no, it was still later in the afternoon, but
Okay.
by my tenure, we were getting in closer to 9 o'clock at night. That's how
Wow.
much pad was added onto the train. And what a lot of customers never realize is they would look at Amtrak generically and say, well, Amtrak, why can't you do something? You own the tracks, don't you?
Right. And here it is, let's see, here it is 52 years later, and we're still having that very same national argument. That's quite remarkable. You know, I love what Winston Churchill said about us, meaning Americans. Americans do get it right after they've tried everything else that doesn't work first.
I think that's very, very good. And the thing is, one of the things that I think a lot of people don't realize is that all these small towns across these various train routes, and you can speak more eloquently than I can. These towns, this train is their line, their transportation line to other parts of the country. And a lot of people don't get that, of how important that is to that particular community and to the citizenry of that community, and how willing they are to work with them. I remember at one when Burlington Northern was contemplating whether to stop the Southwest Chief, we had a regional board with representatives from various towns from Las Vegas, New Mexico to Newton, Kansas, Pueblo, Colorado, Trinidad, La Junta. We were getting states were applying for funding to improve the track because the Santa Fe had now gone south. You know, they weren't using that old pass through coming up the Raton Pass. Very few trains were coming. Freight trains is what I'm referring to, coming through there. So for the improvement, that was going to cost a lot of money. But all these little towns were getting involved in trying to save that train so it wouldn't go elsewhere. And to tell you about the and they would put community money and local money into the improvement of those train stations because they wanted that train coming through their town. And one example that I'll share with you is that at a meeting in Trinidad, Colorado, I'd given a presentation to a lot of the stakeholders, and the mayor of the town comes up to me afterwards and he says, well, Mike, he says, how was your trip in? I said, it was fine. I said, no problem, Mayor. I said, but you could use a taxi cab service in your town. He said, well, hell, Mike, you could have just picked up the white pages and called anybody. They would have come down and picked you up.
You know what? And you make a valid point. I'd like to put in another aside if I might here. I had the privilege in Texarkana of knowing a wonderful Missouri Pacific Lines coach porter, and that's what his title was in those days, by the name of Roy J. Walker. And once Amtrak had taken over, he did not go to Amtrak. He took a brakeman's job on the railroad and later conductor, so he could retire. But Roy J. Walker had the most beautiful cursive handwriting of any human being I've ever met. We still had a chalk train board at Texarkana Union Station. And anytime Mr. Walker was in the neighborhood, I'd always ask him to write on there either on time or late, because his handwriting was so beautiful. But here's what he said. He said it hits right to the heart of the home of what you were talking about how important Amtrak is to the smaller communities across America. And he was referring to those small towns. And he said, Mr. Walker would always say, in those small towns, everybody loves a passenger train, whether they ride it or not every day. the doctor, the lawyer, the candlestick maker, the mayor, the chief cook, they all want to go to bed at night and lay their heads on the pillow, knowing that that passenger train is going to stop in their town today. It just, as you said, Mr. Dwyer, it is a lifeblood to them. And sometimes, again, the older I get, the less I know about everything. But just as an observer of history, sometimes Amtrak forgets that grassroots America owns it. And when that happens, and I've watched it happen a couple of 3 times, as have you in my railroad career, when Amtrak forgets that, that big, wide rubber band snaps back. And I'll tell you, that rubber band is awfully tight across this country right now. It's fixing back.
Well, I think that having, just conversations with other friends of mine, and, they'll say, oh, well, I was in Williston, North Dakota. And I said, oh, Williston, I've been there. Oh, I was in Malta, Montana. I said, oh, yeah, that's where all the paleontologists go to dig bones in the summertime.
There you go.
How about, or Glasgow? And I mean, every town has a story. And one of the great things, and when I was traveling in Europe, I noticed is, and my wife and I were commenting on this, every small town, I don't care if it's got 500 people, 400 people, or 10,000 people, they have a tourist office in that town.
They do.
And we don't have that. It's all left up to the local citizenry or the local mayor to come up with it. And this is the French Tourist Board. We're not talking, this is a national thing, because they want to keep the history of that particular area alive. And so they'll tell a story. And I think that's important too, that sometimes gets lost as we fly from coast to coast and people look down and say, oh, that area is kind of green over there. That's brown over there, or that's a big lake. What's that lake? They don't know. And train travel is an interesting thing. And I didn't mention it earlier, but I used to do research, and I started telling, historical facts about the Sunset Limited. Is that when you'd come into leaving Benson, you went through the Chiricahua Mountains where Geronimo had his stronghold, or you'd come through and then you'd see Cochise, the mountain Cochise, lying on his back, or the old Butterfield stagecoach, all these little, the Marfa lights, the history behind it, or that, that whole area, people would look out there and they think it's all desert. And I said, well, you see out there, that's all, you've got all the old volcanic dormant volcanoes out there. And they said, oh, really? Yeah. It's like old Route 66. You'd go through that. People want to know that because nobody's told them about that history. And I think that's one of the great things that I hope it gets lost on people. They think, well, trains are slow. Yeah, but you get to talk to people and you get to hear stories. And I think talking to people and hearing their stories brings us closer together. And plus you learn something from it. And I've always been a big advocate of, you need to learn. And trains are a great place to that, because think about a train as a city. As I used to say when I was in the training department to a new hire employee, if you stay at Amtrak long enough and you work on the train, you will experience everything from birth till death on that train.
Absolutely.
And every natural disaster.
Absolutely. This is certainly not meant to be morbid. It's just meant to be factual. And that is what happens when there's a death en route. Put them in roomette 2 until you get to the next stop. I've certainly seen that occur.
I had an incident where the Anderson Cancer Hospital in Houston, Texas, I believe it's probably the best in the country for treatment of cancer. And we have a friend of ours that's down there now for treatment. And years ago, we had picked up a lady, and she had an attendant, a nurse traveling with her, and was in bedroom E. And Reverend, I laugh when I say this, the Reverend came up to me. That was his nickname because he was a Reverend in his other life. And he comes up to me, Reverend White comes up to me, and he says, Michael, he said, we could have a situation here. And he was very calm and soft spoken and that. And I said, what's going on? He said, well, we have a lady in this bedroom, and, her nurse says she could expire en route. She might die en route. And so he says, can you come back and talk to them? So I went back and I talked with him, and I said, I understand the situation. I said, but can you tell me one thing? I said, and I don't remember her name. I'll just use Johnson. Where would Mrs. Johnson like to be buried? That's all I said to her. She said, well, she wants to go to California to be buried. I said, fine. I said, if she happens to expire anytime between here and the crossing of the California border, we don't want to know about it.
Oh. And what happened?
She passed away just as we left Yuma, Arizona. And we had just changed crews. And we took her on into Los Angeles, and then myself and the actually the county coroner, we helped her off a train, let's just say it that way, after everybody had left.
I understand. Yes, sir. All right. So you ended your marvelous railroad career as product line director on the Coast Starlight, the Southwest Chief, and the Surfliners. Is that a correct statement?
Yes.
Okay. And I might be misremembering, but I wanted you to tell that story. Was it I think this was in your train chief days, but maybe you were just on one of your trains as the product line director, but you met a famous author or playwright or somebody that you spoke to at length.
And I've met different people, from Mr. Scripps of Scripps in San Diego, to
How about
Pearl
this?
Bailey.
Of course, Miss Bailey.
Mr. Scorsese was a regular on the Southwest Chief. He had a home up there. Suzanne Summers, who just recently passed away. A lot of that. It wasn't as prevalent as I would say the old, and when I say old, the old guard that preceded us, because all the celebrities used to travel the Super Chief or the City of Los Angeles or the Coast Starlight. And I remember one sleeping car attendant. He was an old Pullman porter getting an argument with another Pullman porter about how many U.S. presidents that they had served in their lifetime.
Wow.
And
wow.
But I will tell you one little story about, I used to have a couple, and after the Superliner started, we used to have a 10-6 sleeper that still was on that train. It was the Transcontinental Sleeper. And it would go from LA.
That means 10 roomettes and 6 double bedrooms.
Correct. It would go all the way from LA to the East Coast, and it would connect in New Orleans to the Crescent. Well, anyway, this couple, they would travel every year, and they would get a deluxe bedroom, and they would travel from Atlanta to San Francisco. And one day I was talking to them, and I said, well, why do you choose the train to travel? I said, you could fly out there or, other ways. And they said, well, we take the train to travel because it gives us time to reflect on our lives and the lives of our children and our future, and we are not interrupted. So we have time to actually sit down and talk to each other without the phone going off or anything else. And again, this is in the pre-smartphone era.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Mr. Dwyer, go ahead, sir.
No. I mean, I I can venture into a lot of different areas because I you know, I had
Well,
food. I
that's
was in
that's
food
where
and
I was
beverage
going.
for years. So
I can already tell you we're going to have to come back for part 2 of the Mike Dwyer story if you will be so agreeable and amenable.
sure, that'd be
There will
great.
have to be a part 2. But before we close this one today, what have we left out of your story? Is there a secret? Is there or if it's not a secret, is there something that you've always thought somebody needs to talk about this before this is lost to history?
Well, a good friend of mine, uh, a former manager and a chief, and then he was a supervisor in Chicago, by the name of Michael Sullivan. And I still think Michael
Mike.
coaches wrestling, one of the finest people you ever want to meet.
Fine
Anyway,
man.
Michael, I was a train manager. Well, no, product line. I was in LA and I'd go to Chicago because I believe face to face. I believe in relationships are more important than networking. I think a lot of
Absolutely.
people will go and say, I'm going to go network. Well, yeah, but do you know the person before you send the email? No. Well, go meet the person, talk to the people. I mean, relationships last forever. Networks end the day your job ends. Okay.
That is
And
so true. Say that again. That ought to be in print. That's good.
relationships last forever. Networks end the day your job changes.
So true. So
But
true.
but the thing is, I was saying to Mike one day, and he says, he says, when we go, no one will ever be able to tell their story again. And I thought about it, and because we were brought in on the old low level equipment, we had the fortunate distinction of working with dining car and coach car and Pullman employees who had been in service since forever. They had worked 45, 50 years. A lot of them were in their 60s, early 70s, even working. And I don't think people really realize is all the people that they impacted in their life. And I hope that never gets lost, because we talk about service and we see all these chefs and these dining cars and these thing about Top Chef and this and that, or the best restaurant. Well, there was a time in America, the best restaurant was on a dining car in some place in the United States.
Absolutely.
Whether it was and that's where fine dining started in the United States.
That is
and
correct.
People have lost sight of that. And all these gentlemen were part of that, and part of that service experience. And I think that story's never really been told about what they went through when the railroads closed, that, okay, now it's got to change. It's going to become Amtrak. And the other thing is the onboard employees union, or the Pullman Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Pullman Porters. I mean, they were the only union that was allowed to be contracted out of all the unions. And
I don't think I knew that. Well, not surprising though. In other words, you can have a union, but we're gonna put 90% water and air into it.
Well, correct. And the other thing is, you looked at the makeup of that union in those days, which was predominantly African American. Yes. But I can say that all of them were very welcoming and had a willingness to teach. And the one thing that, and I think anybody that worked on the trains in those days will tell you, is that how they judged you was how you worked. They didn't want to have to carry your load, because there was no other person to come off the bench. If you didn't carry your load, they had to carry your load. And that's how you were judged out there. And that was the great thing about working with a lot of the old guys, and then listening to their stories, listening to them tell about how they used to make marmalade on the train, or somebody would get on the train in North Dakota with their pheasant and say, "Can you cook the pheasant tonight?" I mean,
absolutely true. Absolutely true.
and that's something that I think that's missed is some of the old stories, the nicknames. We all got nicknames from in that period of time, whereas nowadays it's not there. And it was a family. As one gentleman told me a long time ago, he says, all problems are handled on the train. If it goes into the office, you're not going to be here very long.
Amen. What happens, we used to have a saying around here, what happens in Longview, Texas stays in Longview, Texas.
Yeah.
You've two things that I'm so appreciative to you for. Number one, thank you for waxing poetic about the lost stories of the people who are still with us. And I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart of trying to connect me with some of those individuals from dining and sleeping car services who have their own stories to tell. And what you've done is to open the door as we conclude your podcast for me to tell this untold story, which has stayed with me. I still don't, I don't know whether to laugh or to cry. Did you ever know? I don't think you would have come across him. He was an ex-Pennsylvania dining car waiter, Pennsylvania Railroad, a legacy railroad dining car waiter. But he worked for Amtrak out of St. Louis for many years until his death on board. His name was Curtis Bradley.
I didn't have the pleasure. No, it doesn't. And I worked with a lot of the guys that used to work out of Kansas City on the old Super Chief.
Right.
But not St. Louis.
Not St. Louis. Well, Curtis Bradley had been a Pennsylvania dining car man, and he would often wear, there was a famous passenger train, ladies and gentlemen, in the first half of the 20th century that ran from St. Louis to Washington, D.C., perhaps to New York. Mike, you might remember, but it was called the Spirit of St. Louis. Mm-hmm. And Curtis Bradley was a dining car waiter on that Pennsylvania Railroad Spirit of St. Louis, and he would often wear his Spirit of St. Louis dining car uniform out on the road in the Amtrak era. It was just wonderful. Just, in fact, I don't even know if he had his Amtrak uniform handy. He was always in that Spirit of St. Louis uniform. But you'll remember when we got rid of the quote unquote old equipment, the diners with the Presto logs and the gas and the lounge cars that actually you prepared food and drink on board. And we came in with something called Am Fleet.
Yeah. Worked it on the San Diegans.
Yes. Well, we tried it in long distance service on the route between St. Louis, Chicago, St. Louis, and Texas. And let me tell you how it didn't work. But the point is that very, very first trip, and I think this sums it all, that very first trip where the old equipment had gone away and the Am Fleet equipment, meaning nothing fresh, all pre-prepared, all frozen, all microwave. And I walked in there, and here is Curtis Bradley behind that service counter in his Spirit, Pennsylvania Railroad, Spirit of St. Louis dining car uniform. And he looked me right in the eye and he said, "Hubbard, this ain't nothing but a goddamn McDonald McMuffin car." And I'm afraid, imagine Mr. Bradley had seen the height of American rail dining experience, and I'm sure he thought this was a reduction of that tradition, and it was.
The interesting thing is that we all saw the same thing as those of us that were when the Superliner came in. Like I said before, we had a full dining car. We had prime rib, we had sand dabs, we had roast duck. And people will look at you and say, "What do you mean you served that?" Yeah, we served all of that, and it was all cooked on board. But then with the David Stockman era, we went to microwave airline meals. And that's another story. in another time.
So, Michael Dwyer, thank you for your time. Thank you for your legacy. Thank you for the service that you gave to all of us in our working careers to help the traveling public have the best possible experience they can on board. You may not think of yourself as this, but all of us who had the privilege to work with and for you do. Sir, you're an icon to us. And you always will be. And I'm grateful that you came into this podcast, and thank you for agreeing to part 2.
Well, it's a privilege, and thank you for organizing it, Griff. I know a lot of us have talked about it, and you've kind of put not pen to paper, but microphone to podcast, so to speak, so we can tell that story.
Well, the most technically illiterate person on planet Earth, me, is trying to figure this out one podcast at a time.
Well, you're doing a wonderful job. Thank you.
God bless, sir. Thank you.
The Texas Eagle Way, the way to and from and all points beyond. www.texaseagle.y'all. Come on the way, the Texas Eagle Way, through the heart of the nation, a traveling sensation. Get your reservation.